Welcome to Intergalactic Tarboush, eclectic conversations from the MENA with Iyad al-Baghdadi and me, Ahmed Gatnash. We talk about politics, activism, tech, spirituality, mental health, and more. This episode was recorded the day before Russia's ground invasion of Ukraine began, so it's not exactly news material, but we talked about Russia's activity going back to Syria, zooming out to the bigger picture. We also speculate about Putin's intentions and thinking, trying to understand the way different geopolitical actors' incentives intersect. And at the end, we also talk a little about cancel culture.
Hey man.
How's it going?
How are you doing?
Not bad. So I think we're going to have to start with Russia today because it's what everyone's thinking about.
Well, it's kind of brave to predict, and we don't know what's going to happen next. But let's say that a lot of this is a thought exercise. We don't know what's going to happen next. And I just right before we came on, I was on Twitter and I saw that there is that the U.S. administration has informed the Ukrainians that they're expecting an invasion in 2 days. Now, we don't know what's going to look like. We don't know if it's going to be basically in the east of the country, Donbass, or whether it's going to be essentially, Putin trying to take all of Ukraine.
And this is basically something that's been brewing for several months, like since October or something.
Well, yeah, I think the crisis started really last year, but it's escalated very quickly since then. I did see that, in the knowledge base, you had been thinking about the second and third order effects of that, and what it's going to mean, and you had some really interesting.
This is really coming out of basically flashbacks to the middle of the last decade when the whole Russian intervention in Syria happened, and the consequences were absolutely colossal. They changed the face of democracy in the West. But none of them were direct consequences. So the really strong one was basically Putin's bombing created massive refugee waves, which overwhelmed Europe, and it also created a fertile space for extremist organizations, which led to the emergence of ISIS. And both of those two things led to a really emboldened far right, which could point to these extremists and these refugees coming and frighten everyone into voting for populism, which led to Europe's lurk rightwards, Brexit, even the US's Trump election.
So let's go.
What I'm really thinking is,
let's go over that argument first before we get into the Ukraine stuff, because we do mention this in our book, but then it's not the subject of our book. So we did mention it in passing, but maybe this is an opportunity for us to really kind of present the case. The idea here is that what happens in one country, when one major country in the world breaks, it has ripple effects that sometimes are unpredictable. And so we kind of saw it because we were very plugged into the Syria space, all the way from 2011 with the Arab Spring uprisings. I do remember that what happened in Libya too had a very big impact about what happened in Syria. But then that's another whole new conversation. But essentially, just like you said, there is a line of causality that you can draw between the breakage of Syria and the breakage of basically the surge of right-wing populism that happened 2 years later, because two things came out of that: the refugees and ISIS. And both of these things arguably contributed to, first of all, in 2016, the Brexit vote, and then it was 2015, 2016, can't remember. And then Trump. And then the world changed after that.
I think the only unusual thing about this case is that it seems so clear to us. I think these kinds of chain effects are really common, but they're often obscured, or they're several steps down the line, or there's disputed causality. But otherwise, I think these kinds of effects are all around us. And this just feels like one of those big events where we should really be looking out just in case there's something that's startlingly obvious once you look.
Well, while you're speaking now, I just realized one thing. I realized that in my conversation, because I like over the years, I did mention this several times to my audience, and a lot of them are Americans, and a lot of them are associated with the American left, with the Democrats, and they, one other line of causality that probably is very poignant and is underexplored. What happened in 2013, not 2015, 2013, when Obama drew that red line, the US administration drew that red line to Assad, and basically said, don't cross this line, don't use chemical weapons, and if you do, there's going to be consequences. And then he crossed it. And then the US administration, instead of creating consequences for Assad, essentially invited Russia to be the guarantor of this kind of the chemical disarmament of Assad, which actually never actually happened. I mean, he continued to use chemical weapons, regardless. But then this kind of legitimized Russia, basically almost legitimized Syria as kind of, this is your zone of, this is basically your zone of interest. This is your zone of influence. Come here and basically help us keep the peace. And you can again draw a line of causality between that and between how Putin was much more emboldened in 2015 and then far more emboldened now. You can actually draw that line of causality, because keep in mind, 2013 Syria, 2014 Ukraine, 2015 Syria, and now Ukraine again.
So I've seen the argument that the US administration's handled this one a lot more competently. That they've been a lot firmer with the lines, and they've been more active in sending assistance to Ukraine, for example, and they've been quite strong with the sanctions lines. Whereas in the Syria situation, they basically never intended to do anything about it. As soon as Assad and Russia crossed that line, they backed down and tried to find excuses to not act. But the problem with that is, when you draw a line and then you fail to enforce it, you kind of become pushover. People get used to the idea that they can, cross the lines without consequence. And arguably, even the stuff he's doing now, almost 10 years later, is Putin still applying the lessons he learned then.
Yeah, that's very useful, actually, to understand this, because part of me, I was actually like, kind of my early morning kind of shower thoughts. I was like thinking about this in the shower, and I was thinking that maybe Putin did not intend this to get this far. Maybe Putin, like you just said, had this, realized that this has worked for me before. Whenever I threaten a major war, they back down because they don't want instability, so they back down. And so maybe what happened this time is that he did not intend this to escalate to this point. He thought that by mobilizing all of these troops, NATO and the West and Ukraine itself are going to back down. Or Ukraine basically is going to find itself with its back to the wall and no support, and it'll be strong armed into saying yes, whatever you need, because we don't have any allies. I think he's facing a different administration, an administration that was able to. I mean, as you know, we're not exactly fans of Biden's foreign policy, and we criticize it all the time. But on this particular note, in this particular file, they seem to be more competent than previous administrations in handling Putin.
So he's basically backed himself into a corner because of a miscalculation. It seems that he's now in a position where, it doesn't benefit him to do a war, because he'll end up stuck in Ukraine, fighting an insurgency. And if he backs down, it's basically humiliating for him domestically, and also teaches his opponents that he can be intimidated in a way. So there seems to be no win here.
I mean, in a way, I kind of understand the geopolitical element. I kind of understand that, Russia, with its current borders, does not have defensible geographical borders. It's
So
basically very flat.
You were showing me this with the topological maps of Europe, that if you look at a map of Europe that just has the mountain ranges, Europe from Russia across to the middle of Europe is completely flat land, and therefore the reason Russia has so many thousands of tanks is because it has several thousand miles of border across just basically flat, empty farmland that isn't easily defensible.
So I think I actually looked at the number of tanks, and I think that Russia has 25,000 tanks, while the next most country is the United States at 8,000 tanks. You can see the big difference. And yeah, I mean, partly my interest in this kind of came from watching a lot of documentaries about the Napoleonic Wars, and then about World War I, World War II, and about how, Russia has not been invaded successfully in recent history, in modern history, from Europe. And every time there's an invasion, there's always kind of the same. So essentially, he is kind of right that for Russia to be geopolitically stable and sustainable, it needs kind of a buffer zone. But then the way he's going about it, Putin, is through hard power, kind of strong arming a lot of, everybody between him and Germany, to kind of like basically submit to us. This is not how you do it in the 21st century. I mean, people in Estonia and the Baltic states, or in Ukraine, or in Poland, they have their own agency, they have their own history, they have their own cultures, they have their own, democracies. If you want to win them to your side, you should have presented a model, a model for what Russia is, that kind of makes people want to take your side.
That's the thing. When I saw this map, I then switched from the topological map to the political map, nation-state borders. And between Russia and those mountain zones of like a naturally defensible border is this zone of states like Ukraine, like the Baltics, etc., basically Eastern Europe. And the whole, like the explanation being given for this whole conflagration is that Putin feels very threatened by the approach of NATO towards Russian borders, the fact that it's introducing new members and expanding eastward. And the first thing that struck me was, surely the way you'd counter this is by developing some kind of cultural ties with these countries, developing economic ties to make them more economically integrated with you so that they don't want to fight, instead of just basically trying to bully them into submission and making them resent you and long even more for like NATO protection.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of, again, I mean, the thing that I'm kind of criticizing here with most mainstream coverage of the crisis is really that, so he comes along and he says, I have geopolitical reasons, right? Initially, at least before he goes completely unhinged and he talks about the Kievan Rus and history and like his own contorted ethno-nationalist kind of view of history. But until then, initially he's like, there are geopolitical reasons. Now, a lot of commentators like, no, bullshit, you don't have geopolitical reasons. And this I kind of disagree with. He does have geopolitical reasons. But then we have to remember, he had 20 years, he's been in power for 20 years, one form or the other, or, under one title or the other. What kind of Russia did he build? I mean, he could have made a Russia which is an economic powerhouse, He could have made a Russia which is a soft power, a soft superpower,
And fueled by the well-known genius of many Russians in fields like mathematics and physics and computer
Exactly.
science.
I mean, when we speak to Gary Kasparov, for example, who's a friend, and we meet him, almost every year at the Oslo Freedom Forum. He makes that clear, that he's an ex-presidential candidate. He ran for president in Russia before, and he's like, after the fall of the USSR, we had a good base. We had a really good base of scientists and mathematicians and industrialists, etc. We could have built something really good, but then Putin, he took 20 years to build this kleptocracy. Eventually, the Ukrainians are like, we can either look west and we can look at these open societies and we can look at a model that we want to follow, or we can look to the east and it's kleptocracy. So essentially, I mean, let me come back to the point, geopolitical point. When countries have geopolitical crises, they will be anxious and they will be aggressive. But a democracy is not going to fight in the same way as a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy is going to think, let me just break something. And a democracy is going to think, this is dangerous, we have to do something about it, but they're going to fight in a different way. But I would not dismiss the geopolitical element. It does exist.
So this reminds me of a couple of books I read about Russia and Putin last year. Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, and Masha Gessen's The Man Without a Face, which is basically about Putin's rise. And I remember it really struck me how different Putin was to a lot of other leaders. Like I noticed this while I was reading the books, that he's basically, like he didn't come up through this governance kind of background. If anything, his character more closely resembles a gangster or a mafia leader. Like he's basically a thug. I'm often struck by that, like recently, that as I see like the way he speaks and the way he behaves on the world stage, that's basically how he treats people. Like he still is basically some kind of thug rather than a world leader.
I mean, I didn't read those two books, so maybe it'll be useful if you give a little bit of background.
So Red Notice is like the Putin story is a little tangential because it's more about Bill Browder's own biography, but it's the fascinating story of how he comes to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and basically becomes rich, but then runs up against the state. And it's like this Kafkaesque story of how they try and pin corruption on him to steal all his wealth. The Man Without a Face is more like a direct chronicle of Putin's rise, and it kind of gives you the background of what he was seeing as the Soviet Union collapsed, how he reacted to it, and kind of trying to piece together his thoughts from like interviews he's given, speeches he's given, etc., and contextualizing his background and where he came from as a KGB officer to give you a feel of how he felt about the world. Because I see a lot of people kind of trying to fit him into an ideological box, being like, oh, he's from the Soviet Union, but he's not like pursuing some kind of Soviet communist ideology, because he isn't an ideologue. He isn't someone who came up through like the party or something. He's a guy who's used to controlling people for power.
I mean, the part about him not being an ideologue really, struck me, because I was actually listening to some of his speeches. I wanted to know more. If you give someone the opportunity, this is kind of like reminds me of the Joe Rogan model of podcasts, where you have like a 4-hour podcast. The thing is, if it's a small podcast, you're getting kind of very short comments from someone. They can kind of choose their words carefully, but then if it's a 4-hour conversation, you really get to know them. And so I wanted to like go and listen to rambling speeches, like really long speeches. So I went and listened to a few of them. And the one thing that struck me is that he doesn't come across as an ideologue. This is a man who was
He's totally devoid of ideology.
I mean, the thing is, what struck me is that this was a man who was born and raised under the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is supposed to be very ideological. The fact that now that he speaks, he doesn't mention anything about communism. This man grew up under the Soviet Union, but he's not a communist in ideology at all. And that itself kind of tells me something about how much people really believed in Soviet ideology or communism, when it was at its peak, at the height of its power. This itself kind of, can't you see how weird it is?
Yeah, it is quite strange.
I mean, and the thing is, he is an ethno-nationalist, but in a very, not in an ideological way. It's more in a geopolitical way. And, he does have this kind of very, very rough, gruff kind of, understanding of ethno-nationalism. But he is, there is this kind of Russian ethno-nationalism.
And everything he does is basically through this model of brute force. Like whether it's how he treats billionaires at home, it's by basically gathering them in a room and browbeating them live on TV in order to humiliate them, or whether it's through how he deals with the people around him, like his ministers, or whether it's how he tries to deal with other world leaders. Like there's the really famous one with Angela Merkel, where he learned that she was afraid of dogs, so he brought a dog with him to scare her. Like everything he does is, how do I frighten someone or bully them or intimidate them or pressure them, push their buttons.
So that's
There's no carrot and stick.
The thing about dictatorships is that there is no institutional thinking. So the state becomes a reflection of the extremes of this personality who's basically leading the state. By the way, we talk about this also in startups, like in commercial startups, that how the character and the personality of the leader of a startup kind of ends up being kind of integrated and impregnated into the culture of the organization, and that kind of sometimes is difficult to remove. Interesting, what do you say? Reminder here. But I'm kind of, normally our Intergalactic Tarboush episodes are not this grim. I think the fact that we might be 48 hours, away from a major. I mean, by the time this episode comes out, there could be a major war, like a major war in Europe, like the biggest war since World War II. I hope it doesn't come to that. But yeah, I mean, keeping in with the format, and since we mentioned Joe Rogan, and for our podcasts, I saw that you kind of had something about cancel culture in the in your list of things you want to touch upon. So
yeah.
What was that?
It's just been one of those things that you can't escape over the last few weeks. That kind of crescendo of shrill American culture wars going on. So I was basically, I can't remember what I saw, but I must have seen a few things about it. And I sat down to think, like, what is cancel culture? What's this thing that everybody's so upset about? Because this idea that people are basically, like, I think the idea is that people get boycotted for saying something that goes beyond some arbitrarily identified boundary of what's acceptable to say. And the idea is that this boundary is shrinking and shrinking. And obviously that's completely bullshit, because there have been these kinds of boycotts of thinkers and activists for decades and decades. It's just that for a very long time it was mostly the left that was affected by these things. It was radical black thinkers, it was the Black Panthers, or it was liberation thinkers. It wasn't the kind of people who can get cancelled and then go and complain and whine about being cancelled on the Joe Rogan show and on the front page of the New York Times on their column or whatever. So
wait, you're saying that cancel culture or always existed, but it's only when it targeted specific people who felt that they were entitled to the platform, that's when they started complaining this is a problem and this is a new thing.
That's really the vibe that I'm getting. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
We disagree?
No, I mean, we come from a different. Of course, we I mean, both of us, me and you, we come from a different angle at this. Because you're right. I mean, we were kind of censored. We were not really, our voices like ours were not in the mainstream for a very long time. But then we never felt, unfortunately, I think we never really felt entitled to the platform, because the platform was never unconditionally given to us. And so I guess we didn't really, if you're not included, you were never cancelled because you're never included in the first place, I mean, if you want to put it in a phrase some Americans might understand, maybe you and the rest of the Palestinian people got cancelled in 1947. 1948.
You've been trying to get uncancelled ever since.
I mean, they're still cancelling us. I mean, not only it's not only the politicians now; it's also the algorithms and the social media algorithms, etc. I
woke up this morning and saw a news article about how they'd fired a museum director in Manchester, basically because he had an exhibition which was deemed to be too Palestinian friendly by an pro-Israeli lobby group.
It's crazy because they're posing Palestinian liberation as equivalent to Jewish extermination. I mean, and I think that this is deliberate, in order to make this more complicated than it has to be. I mean, in order to make this seem to be much more morally complicated than it has to be.
So yeah, when I'm generous, I think, these guys just started to see that there's censorship now, like it's their first time realizing it. But I think a lot of the time it's not that; it's just that they're outright disingenuous, and it's because. A lot of the time, it's because they're being subjected to consequences for saying things that are grotesquely offensive for the very first time. Previously, they could just get away with saying this openly. And now, oppressed groups have the mic a lot more. And when they say something obscene, they get quote unquote cancelled for it, and they don't like that.
I mean, I feel like I want to say a lot more about this, but then we came to the limit of the episode. So let's save it for the next conversation.
Catch you later.
Thanks for listening. To support us, please leave a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find the link to our Patreon in the episode description. See you next time.